Welcome to Living in Grand Rapids, the podcast. I am Josh May.
I am Katie Arnold.
I am Leah Hills.
And I'm Ross Bacon.
And we are four of the Make Group Realtors with Remax of Grand Rapids coming to you today. Another episode of Living in Grand Rapids. We're going to talk real estate terms today. I like this feature, right? We do this once in a while. We break down a real estate term you may or may not have heard of. And I think this one's an interesting one today. What do we got? Katie, Leah, talk to me.
Yeah, well, today we're going to talk about what is a setback. And we are not talking about a setback in life. We are talking about a setback in real estate. I hadn't heard this term before you suggested it for this episode in a real estate situation. So break it down.
Right. Yeah, I brought it up. You looked at me like I was a little bit crazy, but I got to be honest with you. I've dealt with a lot of doing setback research in real estate because, your local jurisdictions, your township, your county, they're not going to just let you build anywhere, right? They're not going to let you build 1 foot from the street. So one setback would be how far a house needs to be away from its property lines, right? And, your neighborhood associations can have these in their HOA restrictions. Again, it can come from the township, the building, municipality with Kent County, Michigan, for example. But let's just use, for example, a lot of cases you need to have your side yard setbacks, and that varies depending on the lot size, but you can't be too close one way or the other. And a lot of that is done to protect your neighbors. Like it'd be a little bit strange if two neighbors built right on the same property line, right? And then all of a sudden you got one neighbor looking through the other neighbor's window because they decided to build on the same property line. I mean, that's an extreme example, but you know what I'm saying, right, Ross?
I do. I come across this mostly with garages and outbuildings with clients who want to put in a garage or an outbuilding, and they think, so they'll say one thing to me like, hey, I'd love to have a garage here. I'm like, oh, first thing you're going to want to do is check with the township or the municipality that says, can you build there? I know if you build close within 3 feet of the property line, you got to have a firewall on one side. So there's a lot of rules and regulations, and that's one thing you want to look into before you put anything up, even a fence. Something as little as a fence might have a setback.
Digging a little bit deeper here, this is where this can really come into play in real estate, because most homes are built, right? Most homes are already built and, the builder followed the guidelines. But let's say, like Ross said, you want to put an outbuilding in. Let's say you want to put a pool in. Let's say, the general public doesn't really know, maybe where a drain field is on a property, right? Maybe you live in a rural setting, or maybe you live on a 1.5 acre, 2 acre lot, and it's not city water, it's not city sewer. So you can't just plop a pool in anywhere, right? You need to understand where your well is and where your drain field is. And then there's going to be setbacks from how far you need to build a structure from those two items, right? Because you can't build on top of a drain field. That would be a disaster if you built like a big shed or a pool on a drain field. So you've got to have the minimum setback away from that. And even going a step further, like in rural areas, you've got septic tanks. So in most cases, there needs to be a distance away from the actual house that the septic tanks sit. If some of these things aren't followed, they can lead to future violations. And sometimes here's where it gets a little bit tricky. And I know I'm digging a little bit deep here, but I think the public wants us to get deep on this stuff. Here's where it gets a little bit tricky. In my experiences, townships, in order to permit projects, in order to permit a shed or a pool, they actually won't have any setback requirements, but a county will. So if you just go to the township and you say, hey, I want to put this pool in, they'll say, okay. And if you don't actually go to the county and say, well, let's dig a little bit deeper and look at the Kent County health requirements on these setbacks, then you can get into violation. The problem with that is what happens if you put $100,000 pool in and you're in violation of the county setbacks. It's a big deal. Then that affects your resaleability of the house, right? Because a buyer digs into this and they say, well, geez, you guys put a pool here and it doesn't meet the local ordinance with the county. We've got a major issue here. So I know these sometimes seem like very small words, but if you really dig into like how this can affect a home's value if they're not taken into account, I mean, that's why we like to dig deep on this type of stuff, right, Ross?
Yeah, I think that biggest thing is, most people kind of get a little overwhelmed by it, but, it's the first thing you really want to start with. And you really want to make sure, you have the green light before you do any project or anything like that. So talking to the right authorities and surveyors, or just calling the township, you just want to make sure you kind of have your ducks in a row before you start digging.
And then I guess the last thing I'll say is even like, height requirements come into play. People aren't going to want you to build a big old massive pole barn in the front of your yard. So often, the height of that, there'll be restrictions on how tall it can be. And like Ross said, how far it needs to be away from the house. So anything and everything. Basically, if you're going to be building on a property, you need to know all the setback requirements at all times before you invest money into something. Otherwise, it could be catastrophically expensive to reverse that. And that's what we're trying to guard against. So I like the word setbacks in real estate. I think the last one we did was easements, right?
Yes.
Easements and setbacks.
Easements and setbacks. So don't easily be set back. Do your due diligence. All right. Bad joke. Anyway, you guys, thank you for tuning in to this episode of Living in Grand Rapids. Once you've done your research on anything and all thing regards to real estate, just understand we'll be happy to help. We'll let you get back to living in Grand Rapids.
Thanks for listening to Living in Grand Rapids, the podcast. Please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe to this podcast and share with your friends. You can find us on Instagram at MayGroupGR or online at marketgrandrapids.com.